Deep in the hills of southern Africa stands a city built entirely of stone, walls curving gracefully across the landscape, towers rising without a single drop of mortar holding them together. An entire metropolis assembled stone by carefully cut stone, fitted so precisely that some of those walls have stood for over 500 years without collapsing. For centuries, European explorers and colonizers who stumbled upon these ruins simply refused to believe that African hands had built them. They invented elaborate stories instead. Phoenician traders, the biblical Queen of Sheba, lost white civilizations anything, it seemed, other than the truth staring them in the face. Today we're telling the real story of Great Zimbabwe, one of Africa's greatest lost cities, the wealthy trading empire that built it, the mystery of why it was eventually abandoned, and the deeply revealing, often ugly history of how the Western world tried, for far too long, to deny Africans credit for their own achievement. Let's start with the city itself, because before we get to the mystery of its decline, it's worth understanding just how genuinely remarkable Great Zimbabwe was. Located in the hills of present-day Zimbabwe, a country that would later take its very name from these ruins, Great Zimbabwe was built by ancestors of the Shona people, beginning construction around the 11th century and reaching its peak of size, wealth, and influence between roughly the 13th and 15th centuries. At its height, Great Zimbabwe was enormous by the standards of any medieval civilization, anywhere in the world. Estimates suggest the city may have housed somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people at its peak, making it one of the largest urban centers in the region at the time. Comparable in scale to many contemporary European cities, the site sprawls across nearly 2,000 acres of land, though its most famous and best preserved sections are three distinct architectural complexes. The Hill Complex, believed to have served as a royal residence and possibly a religious center, perched dramatically atop a granite hilltop overlooking the surrounding landscape. The Great Enclosure, an enormous curved stone wall, the largest single ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa, stretching over 800 feet in circumference, with walls reaching heights of over 30 feet in places and thicknesses of up to 17 feet at their base. And the Valley Complex, a series of smaller stone enclosures spread across the surrounding lowland area, believed to have housed much of the general population. What makes the stonework at Great Zimbabwe so extraordinary, and honestly, so central to understanding why it confused and unsettled early European visitors so badly, is the construction technique itself. The walls were built using a method called dry stone construction, meaning the builders shaped granite blocks with remarkable precision and stacked them together without using any mortar or binding material whatsoever, relying entirely on the careful, exact fit of each stone against its neighbors to create structures stable and strong enough to last for centuries. This wasn't crude piling of rocks. Some sections of walls featured deliberate decorative patterns, including a distinctive chevron design, a repeating zigzag pattern, worked directly into the stonework itself. Evidence of not just structural engineering skill, but genuine architectural artistry. The people who built and lived in Great Zimbabwe were not an isolated, self-contained society. Archaeological excavations at the site have uncovered an extraordinary range of imported goods, physical proof of just how far this civilization's economic reach actually extended. Excavators have found Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, glass beads, and other artifacts originating from as far away as the Middle East and even from India, alongside significant quantities of gold and copper artifacts crafted locally. This tells us that Great Zimbabwe sat at the center of an extensive, long-distance trading network, almost certainly connected to Swahili Coast trading cities along the Indian Ocean, cities like Kilwa and Sofala, which in turn connected East Africa to the broader maritime trading world, stretching across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. The economic foundation underlying all of this wealth appears to have been control over regional gold production and trade. The broader region surrounding Great Zimbabwe was rich in gold deposits, and archaeological and historical evidence strongly suggests that Great Zimbabwe functioned as a powerful political and economic capital, controlling and taxing the flow of gold along with ivory and cattle. From the interior of the African continent out toward Indian Ocean trading ports, and in exchange, drawing in exotic imported luxury goods from across that vast maritime trading world. Goods that would then flow back inward to the ruling elite at Great Zimbabwe itself. Evidence of their wealth and status prominently displayed within the walls of the Hill Complex and Great Enclosure. So we have a picture of Great Zimbabwe at its height, a sophisticated, wealthy regional capital, home to tens of thousands of people, controlling extensive trade networks stretching all the way to the Indian Ocean and beyond. Its rulers wealthy enough to import fine Chinese porcelain from thousands of miles away, and its builders skilled enough to construct massive dry stone walls that would still be standing, largely intact over 500 years later. This was, by any reasonable historical standard, one of the great achievements of medieval African civilization. And yet, sometime around the 15th century, Great Zimbabwe began to decline, and was eventually abandoned as the primary political and economic capital of the region, its population dispersing, its great stone walls left standing empty, gradually being reclaimed by the surrounding bush. Until European colonizers rediscovered the ruins centuries later, and initially had almost no idea what they were looking at, or rather, refused to accept what they were looking at. Let's address the mystery of the decline first, because it's a genuinely interesting historical question in its own right, even setting aside the colonial era controversy that would later surround it. Historians and archaeologists have proposed several overlapping explanations, and as is so often the case with these ancient collapse stories, the most likely answer probably involves a combination of factors working together rather than one single dramatic cause. The first major factor commonly cited is environmental and resource strain. Supporting a population of 10 to 20,000 people, concentrated in this specific location for multiple centuries, would have placed significant demands on the surrounding environment, including local water resources, agricultural land, and importantly, firewood and grazing land for the substantial cattle herds that were central to the local economy and diet. Some researchers have proposed that prolonged occupation gradually degraded the local environment's capacity to sustainably support a population of this size, potentially compounded by climate shifts affecting rainfall patterns in the region during this general period. Similar to environmental pressures that have contributed to declines in other ancient urban centers around the world, the second major factor involves shifting trade routes and the changing dynamics of that broader Indian Ocean trading network rate. Zimbabwe depended on so heavily for its wealth and prestige. Historical evidence suggests that around the same general period, control over key regional trade routes and access to the most productive gold-producing areas may have begun shifting geographically, with other emerging political centers in the wider region beginning to compete for, and in some cases capture, control over these lucrative trade networks. If Great Zimbabwe's wealth and political authority depended heavily on controlling the flow of gold and other goods toward the coast, any significant disruption or diversion of those trade routes toward rival centers could have severely undermined the economic foundation the entire city depended on. The third factor, connected to the second, is simply political fragmentation and the natural rise of successor states. It's worth noting clearly that the decline of Great Zimbabwe specifically as the dominant regional capital did not mean the disappearance of the broader Shona civilization or culture that had built it. Rather, historical and archaeological evidence suggests power and wealth gradually shifted toward other emerging states in the region, including later kingdoms sometimes referred to collectively as the Zimbabwe culture states, some of which, like the Kingdom of Matapa, which rose to prominence in subsequent centuries, continued many of the same architectural and cultural traditions, including elements of that same distinctive dry stone building technique at new locations elsewhere in the region. In this sense, Great Zimbabwe's decline looks less like the total collapse of a civilization, and more like a transfer of power and prestige from one regional capital to its geographic and political successors, a pattern of shifting centers of power that shows up repeatedly throughout African history, and indeed throughout world history more broadly. So, much like other ancient collapses we've discussed, the most historically supported explanation for Great Zimbabwe's decline likely involves a combination of environmental strain from centuries of concentrated population pressure, shifting regional trade dynamics reducing the city's economic centrality, and the natural political transition of power toward newer, rising regional states, rather than any single dramatic catastrophe, invasion, or unexplained mystery. But here's where the story of Great Zimbabwe takes a genuinely important turn, one that reveals as much about the history of European colonialism and racial prejudice as it does about medieval African history itself. When European explorers, traders, and eventually colonial settlers began encountering the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in significant numbers, starting in earnest in the late 19th century, during the period of intense European colonial expansion into southern Africa. Many of them simply could not, or would not, accept that the local African population, specifically the ancestors of the Shona people who still lived in the surrounding region, could have built such an impressive, sophisticated stone city themselves. This wasn't a neutral, good faith scientific mystery being honestly puzzled over. It was in large part a direct product of the deeply racist assumptions that underpinned European colonial ideology at the time. Assumptions that held African societies were fundamentally incapable of the kind of large-scale architectural, political, and economic achievement that Great Zimbabwe so clearly represented. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence of a sophisticated, wealthy monumental African civilization, many European visitors and early so-called researchers chose instead to invent elaborate alternative explanations, crediting the construction of Great Zimbabwe to almost anyone except the actual African people who had built it. Various theories were seriously proposed and widely promoted during this period. Some claimed the ruins were built by ancient Phoenician traders. Others connected the site to the biblical Queen of Sheba or to King Solomon's fabled lost mines. Still others invented vague theories about some lost ancient white civilization, entirely unsupported by any actual archaeological or historical evidence, that had supposedly once occupied the region before mysteriously vanishing, conveniently leaving these impressive stone structures behind for later African populations to simply inhabit. According to this deeply flawed and racially motivated narrative, without having actually built any of it themselves. This wasn't just an innocent historical misunderstanding that later got corrected through simple advances in archaeological technique, although that corrective process certainly did eventually happen. This active denial of African achievement had real, damaging political consequences at the time. Under the white minority colonial government that would later rule the territory, then known as Rhodesia, named after the British colonialist Cecil Rhodes, the state actively suppressed archaeological findings and historical interpretations that correctly identified Great Zimbabwe as an achievement of indigenous African civilization, because acknowledging that reality directly undermined the racist colonial ideology that was being used to justify white minority rule over the African majority population in the first place. Researchers and archaeologists who published findings supporting African authorship of the site sometimes faced serious professional and political consequences for doing so, within a colonial system actively invested in maintaining a false historical narrative. The actual archaeological evidence, however, patiently accumulated over decades of careful, honest excavation and analysis, was never genuinely ambiguous to researchers willing to look at it objectively. Radiocarbon dating. Detailed stylistic analysis of the pottery, artifacts, and architectural techniques found at the site, and careful comparison with other known regional building traditions, all consistently and clearly pointed toward local Bantu speaking, specifically Shona, origins for Great Zimbabwe's construction, with no credible physical evidence whatsoever supporting any of those alternative, externally attributed theories that had been so persistently promoted for political reasons. It wasn't until after Zimbabwe achieved independence in 1980, ending white minority rule entirely, that this correct evidence-based understanding that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, a genuine, remarkable achievement of indigenous African civilization, could finally be openly and officially embraced without political interference or suppression. It's a powerful, and honestly still somewhat sobering, reminder of how historical and archaeological interpretation can be, and often has been, distorted for generations by contemporary political ideology, and how long it can sometimes take for the honest, evidence-based truth to finally be allowed to stand on its own. Today, Great Zimbabwe stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized internationally as one of the most significant archaeological monuments in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and rightfully so. Its story deserves to be told for exactly what it actually represents: extraordinary architectural and engineering skill, remarkable economic and political sophistication, and deep, extensive participation in a vast international trading network stretching across the Indian Ocean, all achieved by African hands, using African knowledge and African innovation, centuries before European colonizers ever set foot in the region, and centuries before those same colonizers would later try, for their own ideological convenience, to erase that very achievement from the historical record entirely. The walls of Great Zimbabwe still stand today, curving gracefully across those hills exactly as they have for over 500 years. No mortar, no modern reinforcement, just carefully cut granite stone, fitted together with extraordinary precision by builders whose names we don't know, but whose skill and ambition remain undeniably, permanently written into the very landscape itself. And in some ways, that enduring physical presence became its own quiet, patient form of historical vindication, a monument that simply refused to disappear, standing firm through centuries of neglect, colonial denial, and deliberate historical distortion, until the truth of who actually built it, a truth the stones themselves had been silently declaring the entire time, was finally allowed to be told correctly, and given the recognition it had always genuinely deserved.